This is the Open University. But beware, this is not the real Open University, but a synthetic and mendacious Open University devised by Momus, a Scottish electronic folk singer.
Jean-Luc Godard, back in 1965, said something very interesting. He said, you have to have two images. Editing is all about putting two images together. Having one image is not enough. It's juxtaposition that makes things happen. That's a really important insight into what you do when you make things, that often this juxtaposition of two elements is producing a third element. It produces something you couldn't have imagined before you put these two things together. Each of those two things has a fairly clear motive. Let's say they're photographs. I often take photographs and then I love to look at them in a software called Cascader, which divides my computer screen into two and just puts up two images fairly randomly. I mean, it's in the order that I've posted them, but it brings up new meanings. Those juxtapositions might be the colors that work well together. It might be there's some kind of, because we're sense-making machines, we human beings, we love to create sense out of what might be nonsensical. We create meanings where there isn't necessarily anything intended. And that's almost a surreal thing, this principle of juxtaposition, because you get a freshness just by looking at two things thrown together. So I wanted to look at this year, I'm looking back at 2024 and the life of Momus in terms of juxtapositions, and that could be wider than just, editing or putting together two elements in a piece of software. It could be that a couple, living in a couple, is a juxtaposition of two discrete personalities to create something that's more than the sum of its parts.
Little miss, tough it out, wonder what that's all about. Spin it in, spin it out, your weeping water spout. Little miss, tease it out, squeeze it in, squeeze it out, freeze it in or freak it out, your weeping water spout.
This was also a year in which I made two albums. So the juxtaposition of those two Momus albums, Yikes and Ballyhoo, is also very interesting. One of them made in Paris, one of them made in Berlin. I have two cities where I live, so I spent 3 or 4 months of this year in Berlin and the rest in Paris. And in Berlin I made Yikes. No, in Paris I made Yikes. Around this time last year, so it was during the holiday period when Noemi's with her parents in Mulhouse, which is in Alsace on the border with Germany actually. And so therefore I get a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, of solitude, which is very important for me to create things. But solitude is not just this monastic and monadic state where you're kind of on your own. You're also juxtaposing things that you've been through in your coupledom or that you've experienced in different contexts and creating this third thing. It's not been a year of travel. Particularly 2023 was the big year of travel for me. I went to Asia, and so one of this year's albums was really a kind of belated reaction to a month spent in Seoul in April of 2023, and it was in a K-pop style, but it was also very much about using AI.
Yeah, like the butt from Bossanova. Big honey.
Again, I would like to come at this topic of AI, which is perhaps the topic of this year, when people started seeing just what it could achieve. I was absolutely shocked making this spoof commercial for my Yikes album that you could do this amazing pastiche of pretty much every form of music that's ever existed using AI.
Yikes, the executioners come wobbling round again.
This isn't goodbye.
I saw recently my good friend Philippe Auclair, who recorded for L Records under the name Louis Philippe, asking people on Blue Sky whether there was some way to protest, to make representations to politicians in the UK about saving us from AI, about protecting the creative industries. And while I can understand that reaction, for me it's a bit like, you know, complaining about the phonograph when it came along and live music was threatened apparently, or when sampling came along, or there are all sorts of things, you know, home computers starting to get into music. Even, you know, using, I would just use whatever came along. I know it's disruptive, and I know that it means that we have to change, and that's been imposed by somebody else with bad motives, whatever it is, you know, and might have long-term consequences which are disastrous. But use it, make the best of it, and especially use it for juxtaposition. So I would say that the way I've been using AI is a way to buck me out of my habits. AI becomes another entity. It becomes like a person to relate to. And so it's not just me and my feelings about things or my habits or my interests in music. It's about how I deal with an alien form, really, that's descended amongst us and is uninventable.
The answer to everything is always apparently to love yourself. But what if you already do love yourself to death? What then? Self-care, if you dare. Take yourself for granted. You start at the end, work back, and so of course back to front. Get haunted by yourself.
I wouldn't like to see EU-type regulations, you know, that the ones we get on the web where it asks us to consent to absolutely everything in this tedious way. I mean, there are already restrictions to do with copyright and AI that you can't put an artist's name in and say, I want something in the style of Tom Jobim or whatever it is, but you can say, I want something Bossanova from 1965, you know, and you'll probably get Tom Jobim.
His greatest gift is hatred, and the one he hates is you. You're living on the frail branch that he is sawing through, strung up between the night and day, the rights he wants to take away, as he cramps you with the horrid orange pills, the horrid little orange poison pills of death.
And it will have vampirized the archives of Tom Jobim. But, you know, those archives are up there to be vampirized anyway by people who want to do pastiches of Bossanova, you know. So, and I'm thinking about this because I'm kind of working in the Bossanova style. The latest record I did, The Power of Steam, the song I did yesterday, is in a kind of Bossanova style. But it's, again, there's this pre-existing style which we know about, which is, say, 1960s lush, sophisticated bossa nova.
I look in the direction of the butcher's beautiful wife. An odyssey is happen, but it's only ends of the floor. I read in the financial pages that a scandal will become a storm. Notice that the seam of my trousers is torn. Money worries a man or chore, making monsters in my house. It's been raining for a century, it's been 10 years since I lost. I don't believe the newspapers, they can never quite come clean. They even make the weather seem obscene.
voice of Cardinal Polymacoon. Adrift on a sea of polythene under the lights of Studio 2. Slim the sly and rustic Joan rock hot pants through the scene, overpowered by sheer charisma and the power of steam.
I look in the direction of the butcher's beautiful wife, and EDC is happening, but it's totally out of the floor. I read in the financial pages that the scandal will become a storm, and notice that the seam of my trousers is torn.
And then there's me and my limitations and my fascinations coming into collision with that and doing something new with it or different with it. So I think that what I did yesterday has enough kind of variation. There's the repetition and there's the variation. You know, this is the two elements, again, a couple of elements that really define how music works, repetition and variation, and they're both kind of crucial. You can try making songs without any repetition. I did that on the Little Red Songbook in 1998. Generally, people love repetition. You know, the 3 R's, repetition, 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 as Marky Smith said. But, you know, you need, those are two principles which are super important to bring into collision, and to collide myself with a machine's take on pastiche. I've always done pastiche, so I've always brought, it's always a relationship to the other, not just the others in the audience and their tastes and interests and what they encourage you to do, but it's a relationship to existing forms, other musicians, what they've done, most of which you throw out and hate at any given moment, but a little bit of which you cherish. And I'm myself one of those artists who's mostly rejected and ignored, but also cherished in very small enclaves. This year has also been pretty important for me to embrace new software platforms which are patronage essentially, so Patreon, Bandcamp, Blue Sky to escape the political developments in the US, the fascism of Elon Musk and Trump, making X absolutely insufferable as a platform. But basically the idea that I could move to platforms where I would get the very generous patronage of people like the people watching this video, so that I can basically keep providing free material or material which doesn't have to float commercially. I do make money from albums and I make other people money with putting my albums out, but it's not really enough to live on. So thank you so much if you did sign up to my Patreon in particular, or my Bandcamp, download things from Bandcamp and pay there. That's been really important in a year which I was not as affluent as I was in the previous 5 years. I didn't need to do it before, but I need to do it now for various reasons which are too boring to go into. But, you know, life as a musician is always insecure and you have to enjoy the precariousness for its own sake. But my concerns are not, I don't really have pressing concerns, you know, economic concerns or whatever. I get by. I can do a little work when I need to. The last thing I did was write a little guide to Tokyo for the Lufthansa in-flight magazine. So if you're flying with Lufthansa and you see me wearing a kimono, talking about my favorite cafes in Tokyo, that's me earning money, you know, with journalism. Yeah, this principle of juxtaposition has always fascinated me because it is entering into relationship with the other, whatever that other might be. And of course, the choice of the other is very important. I'm always guided to what I see as irreconcilable or glamorous, or I recognize bits of myself that are scattered throughout musical history. So like the vaudeville of the early 20th century, or the cabaret, the Weimar Republic cabaret, or the 1960s pop music scene where there was a great emphasis on originality and dynamism and things changing every year. You know, you can tell each year in the 60s by listening to it in a way that you just couldn't now, because we don't really change our styles anymore. We're not interested. The two again, two countries that I did go to this year was Italy and Spain for two art events, the Venice Biennale art event and the Manifesta one. Venice Biennale in Venice, obviously, and Manifesta in Barcelona. And I don't need much excuse to go to Barcelona. It's just always a pleasure. They're both always a pleasure. But the art world continues to be dominated by the theme of guilt, post-colonial guilt, which is kind of tedious because I don't think art is talking about guilt. Is that really what art is for, to express the guilt of governments who are financing it? It's not what interests me about art. I mean, art is there to make me go wow, and to not to think about the history of colonial abuse, but simply to say, wow, that's original, that's refreshing, that opens up a whole vista in my imagination. Sometimes they can work together, of course, and it's great to see artists of color or women artists much more prominently displayed in these biennials and exhibitions than they ever were before. Absolutely all in favor of that, but I'm not in favor of guilt being the only or the predominant guiding principle of the art world. So in a sense, the art world has painted itself into a corner. And guilt is a negative emotion, no matter how necessary. The government should be guilty. Powerful people should be guilty. I don't think artists, it tends to be a bubble where there's just this sort of symbolic reparation. And even the artists themselves would be insulted to think that they are there simply to make reparation for somebody's colonial adventures 100 years ago, or into the present. If you look at art, it's always peripherally aware of these things, but these things are not centered in its practice. I mean, Samuel Beckett is not writing about the Algerian uprising or whatever. It's happening though, and it probably is informing, the way he describes Pozzo and Lucky in Waiting for Godot, or the Indochine, the Indo-Chinese situation, or his experiences in the Second World War, resisting the Nazis valiantly in the south of France. So, these things are always there as part of the structuring understanding of an artist, but they're not centralized, and they shouldn't be literal. They shouldn't simply be like a kind of inept translation of the newspaper headlines, if we're lucky enough to have newspapers covering these things in any depth at all, which is questionable these days as well. So I'm always fascinated when I'm starting to record an album, as I am now, by the fact that I don't know what it's going to be called, what it's going to feel like. I do know that there are some technical things that interest me, like AI currently. I'm continuing to use AI for the early 2025 Momus album, still untitled as yet. It's not an experiment which I simply did on one album. I feel like it's just a new tool in the toolbox. So a lot of the lyrics I write and put into the engine, I'm using mostly audio.com. What I've done recently is subscribe to the service so that I can get stems, which means that you can actually remix elements. It tends to pastiche a little bit too stereotypically if you let it. So when you have stems, you can actually juxtapose a Bossanova drum pattern with a city pop 1980s bass line. You can start doing much more interesting things when you have the access to the individual tracks. So that's what I'm doing. In contrast to the last album, which was mostly just saying to AI, make me a K-pop track, backing track. It's not as simple as that though, because basically I'm doing hours and hours of prompts and then only selecting little bits of each, and then making my own mega edits and then editing that down and then turning it into something else and doing a different arrangement over the top. And so it's really just using it pretty much as I used sampling in the 90s, the early 90s. And before that, I was sampling with my head. That just goes into the paint box. It just becomes a new color in the paint box, and it simplifies some things and makes other things more difficult. I did think about making either it was going to be a Bossanova album, the 2025 album, because I was enjoying that so much. I love all the associations of South American music from that period, especially of the 60s, when sophistication and jazziness was colliding with poppiness, and it's just the arrangements are very beautiful to me, and I like the kind of percussion patterns and things. But it was either going to be that, or it was going to be like an acoustic guitar album, because people are always saying, Momus, go back to your acoustic guitar days, we loved those, you know, when I was the gaunt minstrel of modern angst. But you know, there's no such thing as a pure acoustic guitar Momus album. We used an emulator too, which was the latest sampling technology in the mid-80s, on Circus Maximus, for instance, which is meant to be my most acoustic album. So there is an acoustic guitar which I rented. I didn't even have that kind of regular acoustic guitar at the time. I had a 12-string Baldwin, which I probably should have used on Circus Maximus, but didn't. But anyway, I rented this acoustic guitar, and then I rented also an emulator too. So that was the Fairlight library of samples, essentially. So a lot of what you hear on Circus Maximus is Fairlight samples. The shakuhachi, famous shakuhachi sample that starts Paper Wraps Rock, for instance, it's just a pure Fairlight library. We didn't do any original sampling at that point. That took me a little, you know, another 4 years or so before I acquired an Akai S900, so I could do my own sampling at home, mostly sampling weird things like Game Boys, but also a lot of, you know, Isaac Hayes and stuff like that, because it was the wild frontier of sampling before copyright had really become an issue. So to me, it's, you know, technology has always been there, and it's always been threatening to somebody. I mean, when sampling came along, it was obviously very threatening to a lot of artists who were being sampled and who thought they were being plagiarized and ripped off, just as they think now with, you know, spiders crawling the music databases for Udio, Suno, and all these platforms that do AI pop. And for me, it's a question of how you use it. You know, you can use it to do generic knockoffs and to avoid paying musicians to do music for your podcast or your television show, whatever it is. Sure, you can also use it as an artist in a creative way and put it, you know, in your paint box as a new color. And as a way to, you know, as an impecunious indie artist, far from taking money away from me, it gives me money in the sense of giving me expensive sounding productions, horn parts that I could never play myself or employ somebody to play for me, can suddenly pop up in my songs in a way that they could only do with sampling and previously. But sampling was not really plastic enough. You couldn't make new horn lines or whatever. So, you know, when YouTube came along, it was exciting for me to find, you know, sax tutorials on YouTube that I could pillage and then pitch shift and to make it sound as if someone was playing a sax on my records. And I got pretty good at that. You know, the collage technique is really my technique. I'm not an acoustic troubadour with a guitar who can go back to those good old days, you know, 1985, when I was in a studio with just my guitar and my ideas, and I've gone downhill since. I don't accept that narrative at all. I've always been fascinated by juxtaposition and editing, in the sense that Godard talks about it, that it is a third thing being produced by the juxtaposition of two things. It's something John Cage also said, that you know, you should use chance operations and random juxtapositions to create something that you could not really have imagined with your own little brain, and your cliches and your habits. It's a way from escaping the things that mar originality, and ironically arriving at a kind of individuality by playing with juxtaposing couples of things, the pairs of things. Pairs, super important in your personal life. I think it's, you know, I'm drawing so much from my personal relationship, which has been a very happy one over the years since 2018. And musically, it's just as important that you just put two things together and you get a third thing, not a baby necessarily, although, you know, maybe my records are my babies, but you get something which you didn't expect. And so what really fascinates me, sure, it's making stories and making songs which seem to be, you know, like folk tales or little narratives which almost are pre-existing, but it's also about surprising myself and finding juxtapositions of sound which I wouldn't have expected to be there present in my records. The current software that I'm enjoying the most is a turntable I think it's called Vinyl, plug-in for various DAWs that allows you to make it sound as if your string parts or whatever are on a turntable and can be made to warp. You can make it so that the center hole seems to be off center in a vinyl record, so it gets woozy and there's a sort of vibrato which goes at 33, whatever speed you wanted to make it go at. And also you can hit the stop button so it goes ooh. So I've got a lot of string arrangements on the new songs which start going wrong, kind of everything gets melty and surreal in a way. Like, why is somebody, I guess it's borrowing from rap and hip hop music as well, that turntablism became important, and there were people with literal turntables. I do have a real turntable with a stop button back in Berlin, but I'm emulating that thing with software right now, and that's really exciting me because I love the melted clock element, the sort of Salvador Dali element that it lends to the songs. So this year, yeah, it's been a year in which habits, I'm kind of terrified by the idea of time going too quickly, and the way to slow time down, because I'm 64 years old and I'm about to turn 65 early next year, and you do start thinking, Jesus, time is running out. I still feel very young and I still feel I have a lot to achieve, and hopefully I do still have a good few decades. On the David Bowie-ometer though, I have 5 years. That's all I've got. I hope it's a lot more than that. But the way I found to stretch time, because time is very elastic, not just in your old age when some people age rapidly and others don't seem to, but also if you travel a lot, you can cram a hell of a lot of experience into 1 year. Whereas if you have very strict habit routines and just do the same stuff over and over, a year can pass very quickly without really any sense of achievement. So making a lot of albums, it might seem that the world is not crying out for Momus albums, but making albums is my way to say, yes, I remember how it felt in early 2024, and then in mid 2024, and then in late 2024. It segments the years in a way that makes them stretch and feel much more lived in for a start, and much more about, it's a way, just like when I make an archive of my photographs, it's a way for me to remember what I was doing and what I looked like and what I felt like in any given moment. It's always been really important for me, diary keeping or commemorating in some way the time as it passes. Otherwise, it just passes too quickly. And with that, I leave you and get back to my work.
Open University.
A choice of viewing now. On BBC Two, you can see a test transmission about the diseases spread by mosquito in sub-Saharan Africa. Here on BBC One, we present the old grey whistle test. This week, featuring a session from Brian Cant of Play School.
He's busy working on a new album at the moment, and the LP should be out in time for a tour in October and November this year. The current album is The Road of Silk.